Monday, June 8th, 2020 meeting of the Texas Appraiser Licensing and Certification Board Enforcement Subcommittee. The time is now 1:32. So we will roll into agenda item number 1 and call for the roll. Chance Bolton, Chair, present.
Buster Renfro, committee member, present.
Tony Pena, committee member, present.
Sarah Oates, chair of the board, present.
Would staff like to count off, please?
Sure, I'll start. Chelsea Buckholz, commissioner, present.
Kathleen Santos, general counsel, present.
Troy Bollier, director of standards and enforcement services, present.
Tony Slagle, deputy commissioner, present.
Melissa Tran, staff attorney for standards and enforcement, present.
Denise Sample, director of licensing and registration services, present.
Is that all the staff members? If members of the public would identify themselves, please.
Joe Waller with fact.
Anybody else?
It looks like there's about 3 additional phone numbers that aren't identified by name. Can you please identify yourself? I'll start with 512-569-4427. Okay, they're not going to speak up.
I think that might actually be Dion, who might be calling. 569-4427. That's Dion, who's she's called in.
Oh, okay, got it. Sorry, Dion. 512-936-3640. Okay, I'm going to try for the last one. 806-792-7101.
That's Tony.
Gotcha. Good. Okay. Thanks. I'm sorry, Chair. I wanted to make sure we knew who all was on the call.
No problem. Thank you. Okay, let's go ahead and move to item number 2, discussion of possible action regarding amendments to 153 TAC 24 complaint processing to define process of bad faith complaints. So if you look at page 2 on the meeting materials, basically what this is codifying in the rules what is already in 1103. This is done basically when we reached out to the ASC regarding dismissing bad faith complaints. I won't go through the back and forth, but ultimately they said, yes, that's fine, you should do that, but you need to have that process codified in your rules. And so we are, the purpose of this is to recommend to the board that we codify this into 153 because the ASC asked us to. I don't know that there's much to this. As I said, it mirrors what is in the statutes in 1103. So there's really not much to this. Does anybody have any questions or have any discussion that they would like to have? Then I would look for a motion.
So move.
Yes, sir.
Do you want it in language or is that sufficient? Do you want the?
I'm sorry, say it.
Do you want the terminology added to the motion or just issuing the motion sufficient?
I think that's sufficient.
So move.
So seconded.
Okay, so I have a motion and a second. Any discussion?
This is Chelsea. Do you mind if I speak up, Chairman?
Sure.
This is just for clarity of the motion. And this is an assumption, so I'm going to just state it, and then you can tell me if this is wrong or right. I assume that the motion is to recommend to the board the amendments to 153.24.
Correct.
Okay, cool. It's a recommendation.
As
It is
presented.
recommended. Okay, all those in favor? Aye.
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 All right, the motion passes unanimously. Okay, on to item number 3, discussion, discussion possible action regarding a new rule and amendments to 1153 TAC 1 definitions to implement enforcement review committee. So these materials begin on, actually this was the supplemental. So what we asked staff to do, and I've worked with Kat on this over the last several days, is to for the enforcement, what we've been calling enforcement audit committees now. But as we've talked about in previous meetings, this is the language to codify the enforcement audit proceedings in which there will be these committees comprising of appraiser, licensed or certified appraisers who are members of the board, which will in effect review the charges that SES intends to file against a respondent, and we would basically determine if there's probable cause for those charges, and would either accept those charges and they would go forward with the enforcement action, or disapprove them. And I am happy to have any discussion. I understand that Mr. Renfro may have some wording that he'd like to discuss.
Well, yeah, I read through this, and one of the things, item D and item I seem to not be consistent, because if we choose to have this committee or this panel consist of 2 members, I'm not real clear on how you could ever get a majority. I mean, you get a majority by having both of them vote in the same way, but if you have a split vote, I would assume as it stands, and you don't have a majority. And so I guess the language ought to say something about a unanimous vote, as long as we stay with 2 members. The other thing I'd like to point out, and this may have already been taken into consideration, but I serve, and Mark McAnally prior to me, and prior to Mark, it was Doug Oldmixon, served as the ex officio member, which is, that's just all we are, is an ex officio. It just happens that I'm an appraiser and Mark was an appraiser, but I don't know if in the context of this language, if I'm technically considered, as I sit on the board, as, quote, an appraiser member, and therefore would qualify. So that leaves you a panel of only 4. And and there's no guarantee that the ex officio will always be an appraiser. So those are just some items that came to my mind as I read through this the other day.
Yeah, well, I mean, Buster, as far as your first point, I understand and can appreciate that. And from my view, I think it should be a unanimous vote. And if it's not unanimous, then it would go forward.
All right. Okay. Maybe that needs some clarification. I mean,
yeah. Kat, can we work on some clarification language there?
Yeah, absolutely. You know, it's hard to kind of envision or anticipate every single sort of issue that comes up, but that's certainly some language we can work on with the if I'm correct, the unanimous vote aspect of it, just to kind of clarify. It would need to be unanimous to move forward.
Tony, do you agree with that?
Yeah, it's got to be that way. Otherwise, you got to add more members, and that's probably too much. So yeah.
Yeah. Okay, and then to your second point, Buster, Kat and I actually talked about this issue and tried to work that because we were saying appraiser members, but as you said, the ex officio member is not an appraiser member technically, And so we tried to clarify that by saying comprised of 2 certified or licensed appraiser board members.
You know, that probably is sufficient. I mean, that's really a legal question. And if Kat thinks that covers it, then you're covered. I would just keep in mind that if that ex officio is not an appraiser, your number of panelists to pick your 2 members from or your alternate then goes down by 1 person.
Sure.
There's no real, there's no certainty. We can't, Mark or I can't really say that it's the next person or whoever. I mean, we serve until the person who appoints us decides or something happens here at the agency where they want to make a change. And so we got no idea of what it might look like moving forward. I mean, it could get to a point where one of these days when they actually hire another secretary of the VLB, that person themselves, as Doug did when he served in that capacity, might want to serve on this panel. So it's just, I mean, it doesn't really affect the thing, but now that I read that language and listen, if Kat thinks that's sufficient, then that's sufficient.
Just to, if you want to make it just abundantly clear, you could just rearrange the words of that sentence to say enforcement audit committees shall be comprised of board members, of 2 board members who are certified or licensed appraisers.
I mean, that clears it up a little bit. You know, I think it kind of says the same thing, but you know, I just wanted to be sure we had thought that and that had been taken into consideration. And, you know, it sounds like you had. It was just my deal to make sure that we had considered that possibility.
Yes, sir. Understood.
That's all I had. Everything else I thought looked okay.
How about you, Tony? Any comments?
Well,
That seems to be sufficient for what we're trying to do, so I'm good with it.
I do want to mention one other concern. I mean, Tony, you serve as a public member. I don't, and Chance, you and Kat apparently put a lot into this. I guess part of me was a little bit concerned that we are not including any public members, even as alternates, and I understand why, and I'm clear of that. I just don't want, and I guess they'll be able to voice their opinion when we take this to the board. But, you know, the panel or the board is comprised of 4 public members, 4 appraiser members. So they are put on that board when it was created for a reason. I just want to be sure that we aren't sliding them here on a portion of what I perceive to be the board's responsibility. And you know, if I guess they can speak up at the meeting, and if it is, I mean, they'll let us know. That's the only other item that crossed my mind, is that we aren't including any public members. Tony, do you have anything to say since you are a public member?
Well, I just think there's just so much technical stuff involved in this that, you know, me being a banker and I work with appraisals, it's not so much foreign to me, but I do at times see the board members when we start to get into appraisal talk, we lose them, or, I mean, it's just not, so there'll be a learning curve. And I don't know that the committee needs a learning curve when it comes to this.
Yeah.
I mean, if somebody was just to demand to be on the committee, then we might have to, you know, to address it, but there would be training first, I think, and then you get on the committee, because you really can't get on this committee and just sit there and try to learn terminology and, you know, all the technique.
Yeah, Buster, I also sort of had that same concern, and I think that when this goes through the governor's new antitrust division, that we might see some pushback from them on that as well, and might need to add a public member. But at the same time, I sort of looked at it similar to our statute for PIC members, which again is to appraiser members as well. So, you know, I guess we'll see going forward, but I would like to get the input from the public members, like you said, at the board level. So I hope to do that.
Yeah, Sarah, that's a good point. I guess, you know, if there'll be plenty of opportunity for the issue to be brought forward and raised if indeed it's the perceived indication that we are leaving the public members out of this process. I mean, the public members themselves can certainly voice any concern at the board member, and then you're correct that when it moves forward, if the governor's office has an issue, they'll make us well aware of it. So, yeah, I say we just leave it like it is and move forward.
Yeah, I mean, I certainly appreciate those sentiments and understand that there may be some that would like to be involved. And I think we can address that, but in crafting these rules, the thought was, just has been said, is that, you know, similar to the PIC committees, it's only appraiser members, and we're not going to have a ramp up time where people are trying to learn how to implement USPAP that don't already have that knowledge and don't already receive ongoing training to that fact.
Good point. I guess I think it's good just to leave it like it is, and it'll come up if it becomes an issue, which is why we have the process the way it is.
Okay, so, you know, given the changes that we discussed, would somebody like to make a motion to recommend this new rule to the board?
Yes, I'll make a motion that we present this new proposed rule to the board with the changes that have been discussed today. So moved. That's my motion.
Second.
Okay, I have a motion and a second. Any discussion? Hearing none. All those in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
Aye. Motion passes. Okay, so the next item on the agenda is item 4, discussions and possible actions regarding changes to the implementation of and amendments to 153 Tech 15 experience required for licensing to remove the initial work file requirement for experience audits. Okay, so recently, we have been considering this and talking to senior leadership on the staff, and I kind of would like to maybe turn this over to Chelsea for a minute to explain, and maybe Kathleen as well, what the new thoughts are before we get into the merits of this.
Sure. Kat, do you want to start or do you want me to?
I can start. I mean, I was just planned on going an overview of, you know, the rules as they stand, as far as removing that initial work file requirement. And the rule is that's not what the rule says, that it's initially required at all. You know, and to remove that doesn't require a rule change. And the first part of the section of the materials sort of just outlines the rules as they stand with the recent changes, the recent amendments that are in there. And then also, you know, there was that question of some of the survey information of asking some of the reviewers of how much they use the work file requirement. And then at the end of towards the ends of the materials is some rule language that would codify this. But you know, my overview of this is, in looking at the statute, there isn't a requirement that to change this would just be kind of a change to the implementation of how the system already plays out.
Right. So the rule right now is permissive. We do not, by rule, have to require the work file on the front end. And so we can make that change administratively in how we practice, just at your direction. The reason why I say at your direction is because this conversation started at the policy making level, at the board member level. And so as we went to the drafting table to make changes to the rule, we discovered that it really wasn't necessary. The rule was already permissive. And so, but I think it's best to ensure that we have a agreement among board members on this shift. As discussed in previously, there A majority of states do not require this on the front end. Many allow the work file to be supplemented at the request of the licensing entity if and when necessary. And if we make a change to our practice, it would be towards that, to not require it on the front end, but to still ask for it when necessary. My suggestion would be that we go in that direction if it is the will of this enforcement committee, until such time as we get to the August board meeting, and we can provide you with staff input on how that process is going. And if that is, if it's going okay, and we can just provide you with that data, and then the full board can discuss the merits of that shift in practice. I can talk to you about the benefits and the negatives around that. I think, having all of the information that you might need on the front end could certainly make for a streamlined process. There is certainly it has been brought to the attention of this board that our process has been slow, and we have improved on that through the use of contractors. And so I do not want us to go backwards, but I think that it is a worthy shift in practice to see how it goes, to just try it. There's no harm in trying this, at least from my perspective. So if it is at your direction, then we could begin that shift as a trial period until the August board meeting. And I hand the mic back.
And I think that's a perfectly legitimate way to look at this. And, some of the decisions that we have to make, we don't know what the result will be. But I think that there are several factors that say to me that this is something that we should certainly, at the very least, try. And if we can do that without having to go through the rule change process, and implement it now, and then when we get to the board meeting in August, then we'll have something. We'll have an understanding of how that impacts the process. And so I think, given that we have the ability to do that, I think we should implement it, see how it goes.
So, Chance, let me I just want to make a few comments, since at the board meeting, I was one of the individuals who had some concern about this issue. And, you probably recall when you first brought this up before our previous committee meeting, I thought it sounded like a great idea. I still think it's a good idea, but the only concern I had, and I think maybe it's a misunderstanding on my part, I don't really know, but I always perceived that the work file was being part of the audit as supplemental material to assist the auditor or the contract auditor or the staff auditor, whichever. It's not always going to be contractors, in answering any questions that they perceived might be a deficiency in the appraisal, any issue in the appraisal that might rise to a level of concern. I always envisioned the work file as being there to assist and to clarify. And I think at our board meeting, there was a lot of input that the work file was being available for a deep dive into it to determine whether or not the work file complied to use path, and to determine whether or not there was anything in the work file that might rise to a level of a deficiency that might warrant a potential investigation. I never thought the work file was going to or did serve in that capacity. I always just thought it was there on an as-needed basis to help clarify. And so my concern was, if we remove that from the process as it is today, that we might slow the process down, because, as I pointed out, and as I think you'll see in the material, the respondent will have 60 days to respond if the work file is going to be requested. And I just don't know how many times we think the work file may end up being requested. I don't know if it's 25% of the time, 40%, 60, or 80. I would think that possibly, and you and I operate in the commercial end of this, and so we always think of a narrative appraisal, and we always think that a well-written narrative appraisal should stand on its own. But from my own experience, and maybe Sarah can elaborate on this, I see and I have some concerns for the residential audits that are done on these forms. Many of the forms I read and review, I never do get sufficient information to be able to accept it. I'm almost 90% of the time having to pick up the phone and talk to the appraiser. Because it just seems to me that on those forms, they get up and they say there's an excuse that there's not enough room in the form. I can't explain it there. And when they can always add an addendum of multiple pages, it just seems like they don't want to do it. And maybe it's a habit of some of their other clients don't request it, so they don't think we're going to ask for it when it's clearly in our scope of work requirement that we want explanation of all adjustments. And so those are some of my concerns. I'm not opposed to trying this. And I'm certainly glad to hear that it doesn't require a rule change. But that was, I wanted to clarify that so that you understood where I was coming from, that I always think the work file was there just to help the process. And we can certainly stop any investigation that might try to come out of an audit through our committee if we wanted to go that way. So that was my only concern, is delaying the process if a substantial number of these audits end up requiring a work file to be processed.
Well, Buster, I appreciate your comments, and they're well received. Here's where I'm coming from, is that one, and I think this is important, that the vast majority of other states don't require the work file initially, and they seem to be able to process their applications. The other thing is that we've been given a directive as a board to reduce regulatory burden on the license holders. This is a way to do that. This is also a way to do it that I think that and not everybody, I understand that there are people with opposing opinion, but I think the majority of the stakeholders are for this. The other thing is that we see reviews done all the time, and I think this was visited in our last meeting, that without a work file. And, you know, although the purpose is a little bit different, ultimately, if there's something wrong with the report, you're determining that there is, you know, there are USPAP issues, same as we are here. And ultimately, I mean, we've been told by members of the AQB that we're diving too deep and we need to stop. And so I think those are several reasons that ultimately I think this is a better approach.
Yeah, and if I could just add, and again, I always go back to safety and soundness for the banking world. You know, I agree with you. Residential appraisals, you know, from those of us who have a commercial background, seem so very short and lacking a lot of information. But if there's hundreds of thousands of residential appraisals done every single day, and they are utilized for mortgage lending purposes, meaning that they, you know, rely on those market values being substantiated within the report, and we're not even asked to do that as part of our experience audit. We're just asked to check for minimal USPAP compliance. So I think that if the mortgage lending industry can utilize those appraisals based on the information that's within those reports, then certainly we should be able to do the same with you know, a much lesser standard, you know, that checklist that we're looking for.
Tony, do you have any thoughts?
Well, I just, you know, I don't think I know enough about the process. I mean, we're trying to speed things up. And it's one of those deals where we'll only know if we did or if we didn't after a few, months or periods of time. I think it's, the effort is there based on, I know you've studied this enough, and this is something that you've contemplated long enough to where, for me, I lean on the advice of the appraisers. The process we do need to speed up if possible. We don't need to make it easier per se. We need to make sure we get the same result. And if we can get the same result with less complication, regulatory burden, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, then I think we've met our mission. If, the thing is going to be, if we end up and we were wrong, we need to be, smart enough to say that and change it again.
I think that's a fair point. So, Buster, anything else? Any further discussion?
Yeah, just one other thing. So with that in mind, I think we ought to try to clarify with these contract auditors, as we continue to use them once we make this change, what it is we're asking them to do, and maybe clarify to them when they should or in what kind of situation warrants requesting the work file. Because what I don't want to get into is a situation where we start sending them the appraisal and they are operating under the same type of level of scrutiny they were before, and then they all of a sudden start going, well, I can't prove this appraisal without the work file. I can't move this appraisal along without the work file. You get the point I'm trying to say? Is it seems like if we don't clarify and give a little bit of direction here of why we're making this change and what it is we really want them to do, and maybe some direction of what warrants a request for the work file, we might avoid the scenario where we get a significant number of requests that then tend to possibly slow down our process. So that's an idea. And so certainly if we can do that, I think then it's worth the try.
Yeah, I think I would love to convey to the folks doing these audits that we're simply looking for minimal competency and not anything else.
Yeah, and I think that I think by sending the work file, that there's an implication there that we're asking for a deep dive. And so I think by not having that, we're saying this report should have all of the things that meet the minimum USPAP requirements. And if it doesn't, then because the clients don't ever have that. So the report, the work product really is what it is that we're checking for.
So on that note, that my background is not in appraisals. Do you want to provide any guidance to our enforcement team on what is conveyed to, or how they do this currently, or what they convey to contractors? Or Troy, do you have any questions about how best to do this?
I'm happy to send a message to our contractors and to my team members to make it clear to them that they need to focus on minimum competency. Can reinforce that for sure, and that they should do that from a perspective of not focusing on the work file. I don't think we tend to do that, but I can certainly re-emphasize that, and like I said, we can do a training on it for the in-house staff, and we can send out information about that to the contractors. It really just is a focus on minimum competency. Are you minimally competent? Because obviously a trainee's not going to be as good as someone who's been doing appraisals for 30 years.
Troy, I have one more question for you.
Sure.
just for meeting expectations of the board members. I think I anticipate that just based on the comments that each has made so far, that that the directive will be to move towards not requiring the work file. If what do you need on the front end to make that happen in terms of a timeline, just so that we can sort of agree today to what that might look like?
I don't know that we need much of anything really. It's just I think we have a sample letter in the materials where we would just change the request to basically say, you know, we're requesting your appraisal reports, not your file.
Okay.
But otherwise, the process would, you know, would basically be the same. We would get those materials, and they would be put in the hands of the person doing the audit, and they would do that minimum competency USPAP compliance review.
Great. Okay.
So we could implement that right away.
Okay, well, in light of that, because I think there's a couple of parts to this, if I might go ahead and make the motion, I'm going to make the motion that staff, as immediately as possible, would change the policy of requiring the work file, and they would report to the board in August how it's going, and that we also recommend to the board that we advise staff of the board's wishes to continue or not continue to no longer ask for a work file initially and an experience audit.
Second.
Okay, so we have a motion and a second. Do we have any discussion? Hearing none, all those in favor? Aye.
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 Okay, we have a unanimous vote of aye. All right, now on to agenda item number 5, discussion and possible action regarding shifting the experience audit processing from SES to LRS. And so, as we may recall, this was something that was proposed by Scott DiBiasio in our last board meeting, so what we've done is we've asked staff to put together concepts to see what it might look like. My intent today with this agenda item is, for the most part, just to have a discussion so that staff can walk us through these two concepts, and so we can understand pros and cons. We can understand what questions we still have to answer, and to get board member input on what they think of the concepts. And so with that, I would like to turn it over to staff to maybe walk us through these two concepts, and then we can discuss it.
Fantastic. Okay, I'm going to let Kat take the lead, unless Kat, you want me to.
No, I'm fine taking the lead. So in this process, we kind of started out initially with, getting an idea of the total number of staff it takes to kind of go through this application process, beginning to end, including the experience auditing process. And so that's sort of what the first section of this document sort of outlines. And here we've kind of gone through, the number of people that are actually doing the processing, the anticipated number of people to conduct the actual audits, and I always kind of refer to it as kind of like a rover position of someone who could handle, commercial and then adjust to residential as needed. And then the next sort of individual would be the person for background checks. And so that was just sort of the overview of, what's it going to take to do the entire part of the process. And then the next sections of the documents are the two sort of structures that we came up with. The first one is to create a separate licensing branch within TLCB. And it's, kind of exactly what it sounds like. It's just shifting that auditing experience part out of SES into a newly created branch, and then also the process that's currently in the licensing and registration services to that branch within TLCB. And then, going further down, we sort of outlined the specific advantages to this structure, and then also some challenges. And again, a lot of these, what we've included is just to sort of facilitate the discussion for you. So if there's any, specific questions, feel free to ask. But if we want to move on to the next structure, it's creating a TLCB team within LRS, and that requires shifting that auditing function from standards and enforcement to the licensing division. And again, we have sort of the specific advantages that we sort of see moving to that sort of structure, and then some sort of logistical questions and other challenges. And then towards the end, moving past the second structure, we sort of have, the other policy considerations moving forward. And then finally, the questions that we kind of need clarified from the board just to kind of figure out how to move forward. And then finally, the other considerations that staff would need to kind of implement either structure. So I don't know if you have any questions, or this is sort of how I anticipated this discussion might go.
I'll say just a few things. So staff has met twice with as a pretty broad collection of folks, me and Tony Slagle, Kathleen, members of the enforcement team, licensing, to just brainstorm this and to just put our ideas on paper. The thought is that, just as you've seen, you can shift the function to our current licensing division, or you can create a new division within TALCB. The purpose of both was to eliminate the perception that this function, the audit function, is an enforcement action of sorts, because right now our staff who conducts these audits are our enforcement staff. And I'll tell you that the reason is that the skill set required to review an audit is a very similar skill set to the enforcement process. However, the function is very different. And so regardless, we will need to either hire staff in the licensing division or have staff in the TALCB licensing division that has a skill set that allows them to review these audits in a meaningful way for purposes of consumer protection. So with that, I mean, we're really looking for your feedback. I mean, the administration of the agency, the structure of the agency is something that I oversee. But this was a request of ours. I mean, it was a request of yours that we consider the shift. So as such, I'd like to get feedback on what you'd like to see with a shift.
So from my standpoint, I agree with you. The overall function here is to, in reality and in perception, separate enforcement from experience audits, which is a function of licensing, the licensing process. When you put that part of it, it's outside of licensing and enforcement, it's a chilling effect. We know that. We know that people don't take on trainees because they don't want to be subject to enforcement actions. It's my view that these audits shouldn't have anything to do with enforcement. These audits, the auditing process should be a safe space that I have no problem if there are issues that need to be pointed out to the applicants that you have some deficiencies here, and there's remedies there. You can be critical of the work. You can deny the application, but it shouldn't end up in an enforcement action. I think there can be exceptions to that. I think if there is mortgage fraud or collusion or something along those lines that is really a crime, that crimes should be referred to criminal justice agencies. And shifting the audit to licensing, I think we can take that out. Now, do I realize that that is a pretty big reform? If you're talking about fundamental restructure of one of the basic functions of our office, I get that, and I want to say that I'm very appreciative of the concepts that you put together and the thought that's gone into this. I guess what I'm trying to do is understand, Chelsea, what is the question that you're asking us?
Well, I don't know that I am. I mean, I'd love your feedback on each of these proposals. I think it is you who have asked us to shift the experience audit from SES to LRS. And so one of these does exactly that. The other is a little bit different. And so perhaps primarily I need your feedback on that alternative. I don't have a timeline for this. I don't have a preference between the two. I'm in an information gathering stage. So really, I think I'm just looking for. I am wanting to ensure that because this is something you have asked of me, I do so in a way that fulfills your expectation. And so with these two ideas in mind, I'd just like to know whether or not you have any preference or if any of this is hogwash. I don't think it is, but really just how best to implement what you've requested. And I'll tell you that this is something that is hard on some of our staff who feels like they just do their job. I need to determine how best to implement. Let's say we did the shifting the function to LRS. LRS does not currently have an expertise to do this work, or the capacity. So we would need to hire that. So that would be eliminating that function within enforcement and moving that to LRS. Well, would you shift some of those people? What would that process look like? I'm committed to taking care of people within our organization, and they know that. But what is your tolerance for shifting human beings to LRS? Do you know that we cannot cover that from a budget perspective within our current staff? We will need to do some hiring. So I just want to hear from you on that.
Chelsea, moving somebody from one division to another, what is that, for those of us on the outside, what does that look like, or what does that mean? And would you anticipate that there would be, I'm assuming they would stay in their office, they would just essentially have a different direct report is kind of the way I'm thinking of it, but maybe it's more complicated than that.
I would see that as a physical move just on the very face of it, those divisions don't neighbor each other. They're in different places on our floor. So I would move the people who are moving to LRS to that physical space. But more importantly, it would be a new supervisor who could convey, and I'm not suggesting that Troy is conveying anything differently than this. I want to make that clear. But by putting the function under a licensing entity, that oversight is just different, right? You just have a different mission. Our supervisor, Denise, can speak to this if she'd like, but she would have somewhat of a learning curve of how to measure the capability of these staff. She is not an appraiser. She doesn't have that skill set, though she's very willing to do what it takes to oversee the staff. So it can look a number of ways, but it would be a physical move of individuals to that division, likely in a competitive process, right? You post jobs and then interview for them and hire them.
So currently, is there, how many, the enforcement staff sort of, there's not like one person dedicated to audits, is that correct? Or is
It's, Troy can speak to this in much more detail, but our appraiser investigators, Troy, just you speak up if I say anything wrong, all do both investigations of complaints and then also audits. Is that right, Troy?
That's correct.
Okay.
Okay, and so how is that assigned? Is it just a rotating basis? The residential go here, 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 and here and start back over, or is it?
It's a number of factors. The case manager assigns things based on competency, based on workload, based on residential versus commercial. So yeah, but it's parceled out based on all those different factors.
Okay, so all SES staff works on both audits and enforcement cases.
Yes, ma'am.
With the exception of, I assume, the legal side of it.
No, the staff attorneys handle both kinds of cases, just depending on what bubbles up from either from the audit. I mean, it's
right, but assuming it's a clean audit, then it never really touches the legal side, I'm assuming, or is there somebody over there that's managing the administrative part of it?
Yeah, so it does go back to legal for processing and for legal sign off and all that kind of stuff. But yeah, it's much more administrative process when there's most of the time when there's not any issues.
Right. So right now with the CRAs, somebody internally assigns them out, and then is it an appraiser that manages it when they come back, or is it?
Yes. So it gets sent out by the support staff after properties are selected, and once it comes back from the contractor, then one of the investigators, one of the appraiser members of the staff, looks at it, prepares a quick summary, and it's off to be processed, typically for an approval.
Troy, does that investigator, I mean, when you say they write up a quick summary, are they, and maybe this is just, are there examples where they've disagreed with the results or the conclusions of the CRA?
No, it's nothing like that. In other words, there are typically minor and insignificant findings from the reviewer that are minor technical USPAP compliance issues. And we use the brief summary to make it clear in the record that there wasn't anything significant or meaningful that would call into question the audit, so that when our federal auditors come through, they can see that there's no issues. So no, we're never disagreeing with the reviewer. That would be a nightmare for an attorney to have two different appraisers with different expert opinions. Nothing like that. It's really just to document the file for purposes of our federal oversight.
Okay, thank you.
I got a couple of things I was wanting to just maybe discuss. I appreciate the time and effort that went into the material that's before us. and whoever worked on this, I wanted to thank you for the time you put into it. You know, it sounds like a really great concept, especially when you talk about the idea that you are going to remove the licensing process from the enforcement. It kind of maybe gives everybody a feeling of safety. I mean, I think Chance may have alluded to that previously, and I like that concept. I think that's great. But I also want to, I don't think our intent was to say we're always going to be using the contract reviewers. That was a fix to get us out of the backlog we had. And at some point, I thought this was going to go back to staff. And if we were to remove this and create this new division, certainly, yes, we got to have qualified individuals. I just would be very hesitant to make any wholesale changes that are going to result in us having to go to our stakeholders and ask them for higher fees. Because we talk about removing the burden. To me, one of the biggest burdens is the fee we pay. And I think it'd be hard to make a sale unless we have a really laid out, detailed plan of what we're going to do, how this improves the process, how this makes everything better. It's going to be a hard sell to ask everybody to pay higher fees. So with that in mind, I really want us to think this through before we start making this move. The other thing is I can still in my mind envision cases where that might arise out of an audit that do warrant some consideration and investigation by enforcement. I would hate to think that we would always turn a blind eye to some gross negligence or ethic violations that might get uncovered. I can think of a few in my mind that could result from an audit. And so I just, you know, there's a lot of things to be thought through here before we try to make a significant change like this. Just some comments that are running through my mind. Thanks.
Buster, I wholeheartedly agree with you. And for today's purpose, it was my purpose was let's have a discussion and kind of figure out those kinds of questions. We don't have to necessarily answer them today, but I agree with you. There are times if there are ethical issues, fraud and so forth, that would be an exception. Use patent deficiencies that are, you know, frankly, teachable items. And that's what I think this licensing, if you do have deficiencies, licensing can identify those and can instruct you. And you may not get your license right now, but you, in my view, it doesn't warrant you also getting fined and so forth. You know, I do agree that ethical issues are different, and I think we would need to kind of work that out. You know, as far as what exactly constitutes those issues that would refer you to enforcement. But I think by and large, most trainees who go through this process are doing everything they can to do it right and try to get their license. And those that aren't, then they can be referred. But again, you know, I think it's good to talk about these things, and that's what my purpose was here today. I don't foresee us having any recommendations for the board in August on this, but I do want to start the conversation. And Chelsea, to your points, you know, I don't know if I have any answers on how this looks within the agency yet. I'm happy to dig into it and, you know, try to form some opinions. But a lot of this is, you know, logistics and administration.
Yes.
And so, you know, I think in that case, I would defer to you and your staff on how that's implemented.
Sure, and I appreciate that, and am grateful for that. Actually, I had just a few thoughts based on just listening to your conversation. One is I want to stress that I understand the perception issue, and it's a very worthy consideration that I think we need to address. The other side of that tension is the expertise required to do a meaningful review, though duly noted on the minimal, I wrote down the word, minimally competent. But I do think that therein lies our tension of the perception, and then making sure that there is an expertise available to review that those documents for minimal compliance. I also wonder, and this was just sort of a thought I had, if your enforcement review committees may be something that you may be, I know that you're trying to solve various pieces of a pretty similar challenge. And this may be an instance where if we have a perception issue that we are over enforcing, I'll say, based on experience audits, that can also be solved through the enforcement review committee process, because you will be the gatekeeper to what moves forward, right? So it may be that you want to consider doing the committee route or the other route first, and then see where we are. But then lastly, I do think that this is an issue that we want to get on the other side of, one way or the other, simply because of the toll it takes on our staff. Simply by saying we want to examine whether or not this function should shift from one division to the other immediately puts employees on notice that their jobs may change, may go away. You know, I'm not suggesting any of that would be the case, but that's exactly where human beings go, right? What does this do for me? And I want to be very sensitive to that, and I want to get on the other side of that as quickly as possible for purposes of morale within the agency. So I'll leave it at that.
Well, yeah, and I would say that I know that it's difficult for us to find appraiser experts, you know, just in general. And so it's probably a non-starter if we don't have anybody on staff that would be willing to move to another division, sort of away from the legal and enforcement aspect into the, you know, more facilitating licensure aspect of it. So I think maybe if somebody talks to that staff, we might, you know, have that answer, and it could help us guide us going forward. But I would say that the board enforcement committees, I wouldn't anticipate that necessarily to be necessarily helpful in this process, because the issues that we've heard are not from people who didn't eventually get licensed. It was just people that went through a very arduous process to get there. And so so I think that would still, you know, that doesn't.
I was looking at it from the standpoint of
sure, eventual complaints.
Of supervisors not wanting to take on a trainee for fear of an enforcement action against them.
Right.
Mr. Bolton, this is Tony. I just listening in. I'm just curious to see is there an option, and maybe we can consider the option just based on an efficiency quotient, just of merging the departments. If you've got talent that has the ability to do, you know, jobs in each of the departments, so that they don't feel as if someone might be eliminated, you might feel like you possibly could maximize talent and have one foot in both departments at the same time by simply merging the departments and then utilizing the skill sets. Because in government and also in large corporations, things often can get compartmentalized to where someone feels like they just have one job, and that's not the most efficient way to do things sometimes. And if it's maybe something to consider is to be efficient and to merge in some places where, you know, we could maximize some talent and, you know, alleviate maybe some of the concern over what Chelsea's maybe having to deal with.
Yeah, I mean, from my standpoint, I'm open to anything at this point. My purpose here was there was a suggestion made, and I wanted to explore it. And obviously there are pros and cons to these types of concepts, but I guess I have a hard time seeing exactly how a licensing and standards and enforcement division, what that looks like. And again, one of my tenets in all of this is separating the application process from the enforcement process. And right now, it's intertwined. And I think, and correct me if I'm wrong, but Troy, I mean, you and your staff view an enforcement case and an audit case is virtually the same thing as far as the investigative side of it. And what I'd like to do is separate the two. An experience audit is not an enforcement action. But that being said, I'm open to any solutions here. And if there's a way that combining it alleviates some of the stresses of reform and can accomplish the same goal, I am all for considering that. I'm just having a hard time figuring out how that works exactly.
Yes, it is a very complex issue when you look at it in the depth that we will have to, from budget issues, staffing issues. I certainly understand your position, Chelsea, working here for an agency. Anytime you hear about a change, everybody starts gossiping and getting nervous about their position and if it's going to go away or, I understand what you're saying. But yet it is like Chance pointed out, it's a very complicated issue of how to make it work and make it work most efficiently. And, I've been around in this business for a long time, and I think it keeps going back and back to the point that a lot of people are nervous about sponsoring trainees because they don't want to end up into some type of investigation as the result of that trainee's audit. And we're moving forward, and I perceive that this change is to help clarify that, to distinguish the licensing from the enforcement. And I believe there's some merit there, and I still think it's worth considering. But I do also think, to your point, Chelsea, that if we were to boldly go out and make the comment that once we create this enforcement review committee, that we make the statement that no investigation will arise out of an audit without being vetted by the enforcement review committee, I think that we could get a lot of mileage out of that. I think we would alleviate a lot of concerns from people that you're not going to have a trainee turn in their experience, go through an audit, and end up in an investigation until it's been vetted at multiple levels with the board having the final say. I think in the meantime, there's some value there, I think, until we work out this other issue, until we dig in and see what's the best way to separate the two.
Buster, I think your comments have merit. And as I said, this is a discussion, and once we do get this up and running, the board committees, then you're right, it may shake out a lot of this stuff. And if that's the solution, then that's great. I'm all for it.
Well, and in the meantime, I hear loud and clear that part of my responsibility is to lead this agency in such a way that has a distinction between enforcement and licensing, and to treat those processes, even in our own heads, as sufficiently different. And I am committed to making sure that is true in the hearts and heads of those who work on these cases and these applications.
Okay, so does anybody else have any thoughts or on this particular issue? Okay, well then, do we have any motions? Just okay, hearing none, then let's move to item number 6, discussion and possible action regarding fiscal year 2021 budget reductions in response to the governor's direction. So in this case, we had been informed that the governor intends for agencies to reduce their budgets going forward due to reduced income to the state. And my understanding is that because we're SDSI, we generate our own income, we're not necessarily subject to that, but that we as an agency might want to participate in the spirit of that. And I just wanted to start the conversation as to thoughts on ways that we may reduce the SES budget to in accordance with that.
Is this a budget committee meeting?
I didn't mean to step on any toes, Tony. Sorry about that. But since you are head of the budget committee, then we would certainly welcome your input here.
I mean, I just think that each time we get together and each time, it is priority from day to day, month to month, quarter to quarter, to kind of have this on the backs of our mind. One of the big things we talked about at the last board meeting, and then even before that in our budget meeting, was to play a little defense too. And sorry for that sports vernacular, but that's something that we do sometimes in banking. Over the last 90 days, we've done that quite a bit. Just with the unknown, you make sure you're also playing defense, meaning you're breaking down your income statements from the expense side as well. So I think it is a focus of ours on the budget committee to be cognizant of what you're spending, as well as not just what you feel like you're bringing in. So it is first and foremost in my mind, whether it be at home or here at the bank or within the group known as Budget Committee for the TALCB, to really be mindful of our budget. So I mean, I think this is right on track with what we've been attempting to do and will attempt to do this year and next year.
One of the things that I wanted to talk about specifically is, and we've, over the last several, maybe not the last enforcement committee meeting, but before that, talking about how do we wind down the CRA program. Obviously, that's a lot of revenue that we're spending for those services. And at the same time, we've also increased the staff. And it seems to me that continuing to spend, I want to say, I think I have this right, maybe like $170,000 in the last 10 months on these reviews is not sustainable. And so as part of this reduction that the governor has directed, although I realize it's not necessarily to us, I want us to be thinking about how we start to do that, where we're not spending $2,000 or $2,500 on each one. And I realize all this kind of goes hand in hand, and we're talking about new potentially audits being done in licensing. So that would, it seemed to me that would be a solution for getting or terminating the CRA program, but we're not there yet, and we may not ever be there. But I want to figure out, I'd like us to be moving towards how do we start winding this down, and at the very least, reducing our reliance on that. I mean, my intention when we first started talking about this is that was to catch us up, and we've done that. Now the question is, can we sustain without using CRAs? And if so, we need to start doing that. And if we can't, we need to figure out how to.
Mr. Chairman,
Yes, sir.
if I could just give you a little bit of a staff update. That's actually what my team has been working on. We proposed when I worked with the finance division for the first draft of the budget, we drastically cut the contract reviewer budget in the recommended draft budget, with the expectation that now that we had hired up the staff and trained them all, that we could transition away from that. So if you look at the proposed budget for FY21, it's significantly reduced. I want to say by over $100,000. Don't quote me. I don't have the numbers in front of me. But okay.
Sorry, this is Chelsea. I just pulled it up out of curiosity. So the projected actual expenses for 2020 is 168,000. And the proposed budget for 2021 today, which is, it's not approved, is 48,000.
And the idea, Mr. Chairman, was that now that we've hired on the new staff and they've been trained up, we're slowly over this summer, as we finish out the remaining allotments for the current fiscal year of contractors, ramping up the internal staff, picking up that slack, so that when we get into FY21 with a much smaller number of reviews that we can outsource, that the staff will be doing the lion's share of the work.
That's great. So, Troy, so if the budget is 48,000, and let's say that we're maximizing the payment, and I realize that some cases, and you tell me if you can tell me more specifically, we're not always charging being charged $2,500 for the audit, but if it's at full price, that's 19 and change audits. So how many commercial audits are we doing right now on an annual basis?
You know, I don't have that number in front of me. I looked at the report, the April staff report. I think last fiscal year we reached a high of 204. Let me see if I can pull that back up real quickly and see if I can see what the breakdown real quick is here. Bear with me. But
so I mean, I guess my point is that so rough numbers, we're talking about 10% of the audits would be outsourced. Can you tell us what those would look like? Why you would send those out as opposed to in-house, since it's only 10%?
I would say that it would just be a release valve to the extent that you were over to keep from getting any sort of backlog if you were to get more than expected in a given month or something like that.
Yeah.
I get that. I think that's a totally reasonable expectation.
So I'm looking at the audits. This is on the April report, and right now in FY20 we've received 147. This is as of the end of April total, and 40 of those 147 are commercial. Last year in FY19, a full year, it was 204 total, and of those 49 were commercial.
So that would be like 40% that were farmed out. I mean, if we're talking about a budget for 19 audits.
I'm sorry, I'm not understanding your question.
Well, I'm just trying to understand. So, I mean, the CRAs are for commercial audits only. And so, and how many did you have in the last full year? Was it 48, did you say?
Yeah, let me pull that back up. It was FY19, there was 54, and year to date, as of the end of April this year, has been 40. So 49 last year, 40 this year so far.
And then, but I guess what I'm saying, if you have $48,000 budgeted, then that would be somewhere between 40 to 50% of your commercial reviews were going to be done by outside people.
Oh, no, I should clarify. If you look at, I know you don't have the budget in front of you. There was an additional amount allotted for the specialized complaints that involve specialized work, like a condemnation, for example, or other skills where the staff didn't have the expertise. So there's a portion that's for the audits, and then there's a small portion that's for the complaint side, the specialized work.
Does that require an RFQ? Is there an RFQ for that, the specialized complaints?
I don't believe that there was that requirement. I'd have to ask purchasing because they handle all of that.
Okay, because I just remember when we started talking about this with the audits, the RFQ was a big deal and a required component. I'm just curious what would make the distinction for the contractor, one that requires an RFQ and one that doesn't.
Yeah, and I think it has to do with the dollar amount, if I recall correctly.
So what do we?
As a new board member, has there always been specialized complaints? I had always assumed that went to PIC members, but so there's always been some outlet for specialized complaints.
Yeah, sometimes. I mean, we try and utilize the PIC members whenever we can. Obviously, we're dependent on what types of background they have and their availability. And we've obviously tried to select a diversified in-house staff. So I just wanted y'all to be aware that we'd worked real hard on this first draft of the budget to reduce the amount that we're putting towards contractors in general.
So it went from 168 in 2020, and that included both CRAs and specialized complaints. So that's a number that's together in both instances.
Yes.
Okay.
Okay, well, I'd love to hear anybody else's thoughts that we can be planning on, refer to the budget committee going forward. But I would encourage everybody to be thinking about these things and ways that we may be able to save some money for the agency. Any other discussion? Okay, well, let's move on to agenda item 7, review of committee meeting action items. So I guess we have recommendations to the board for the bad faith complaints, the rules for the enforcement review committees. On agenda item number 4, we have asked that Chelsea implement the removal of the work file requirement as soon as possible, and that we will, as a board, visit that in August. And then I've asked that people think about ways that we can save money. Can anybody else recall any other actionable items? Okay. Number 8, discussions regarding future agenda items and meeting dates. Does anybody have any items that they would like to address in the next board meeting? Excuse me, the next enforcement committee meeting?
Chance, could I ask the enforcement committee to, now that the board enforcement committees, is that what we're calling them? Now that they are, that component is moving, to ask the enforcement committee to sort of identify, I know at some point that we saw a triage of how complaints were triaged, sort of identify when in the process that is triggered, so that it's not triggered unnecessarily for things that are easily able to be dismissed, but so that we have an actual process for when those committees are triggered.
Yeah, so it gets triggered before enforcement formally charges somebody and sends a letter that says, we are charging you with these allegations. We would approve it before that happens.
So does that need to be codified? I mean, because there's sort of statutorily and by rules, there's sort of a step in the process, like the commissioner will appoint an investigator, and then there, at some point there's an investigative report. And so I think it probably, we would want to make sure that that is codified so that it's not just something like a PIC review that gets used just at anybody's discretion, that it's.
Understood.
Okay.
I'm sorry, I'm just reading through. Kat, do you see a place that we would insert that, or working off the rules? I mean, the staff makes a presentation to the enforcement audit committee, and then the decision is made either to move forward with formal charges or no. And so, that would be, I think logically that's after an investigation is done.
I think so. I think after maybe the completion of an investigative report, and Troy, chime in if there's anything an issue with having it take place at that juncture, because it would be my understanding that if something didn't get to that point, it might have been dismissed for another reason that hasn't rise to the level to get in front of this committee.
Right. I mean, I guess it's a good clarifying question for me to understand. I'm assuming that you wouldn't want to see cases that would otherwise be dismissed. You only want cases that we believe there's probable cause to go forward with. And so if that's the case, then yeah, I would agree with Kat completely that you would want the investigative process to be finished, so that you could so that staff would have formulated that probable cause recommendation.
Well, I'm thinking of it from a resource standpoint. To me, these board enforcement committees would help in somewhat in the triage part of it, before we utilize a ton of staff resources investigating something. And Chance, maybe you and I need to just have some further discussion about that, and then decide whether the enforcement committee needs to pick it up further.
Okay, we can do that. Is it something that we can simply say, well, I mean, I see your point, Sarah. But at the same time, I think it's the staff should have an opportunity to reach some conclusions that we would, and also put together evidence that we can evaluate. Maybe we just need to have some more discussions.
Okay.
And, we can certainly, as we're proposing this rule to the board, we can certainly, it can certainly be amended at that level, should we need to.
Perfect.
Okay. I don't, I'm not going to call a future meeting date at this time. Does anybody else have anything? Okay, well, in that case, the time is now 3:01 p.m. and we stand adjourned. Thank you, everybody, for your help and your input today. It's greatly appreciated. Look forward to seeing all of y'all soon.
Thank you. Y'all have a good
Bye.
afternoon.
Bye, take care.
Bye.
Thank you.